Hello, welcome to another edition of The Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and today, this is being recorded late on the evening of March 8th, 2025. And we're going to talk about something that has come up in some of my writings from time to time. It may be a bit of a surprise for the Orthodox Nationalist here. I've been talking about it, and I get asked about it actually quite often. And that's the notion of sex and sociobiology, the red pill, the incel phenomenon, and the approach to modern, or I should say postmodern sexuality. Several years ago, when I was recovering from a bitter divorce, I discovered a man named Rollo Tomassi. And I read all three then volumes of his series, The Rational Male, and I read them all in one sitting. There's 4 now, and I've read the 4th, of course. His analysis in these is compelling, occasionally brilliant, distressingly incisive, mentally acidic, horrifyingly depressing, all at the same time. The truth is rarely pleasant, and the scales fell from my eyes. His work is path-breaking, and it reveals truth that many men, including very intelligent anti-feminist men, don't want to accept. Now, understand where I'm coming from in this regard. I'm 53 years old. I've had many relationships in this period of time. I defeated my ex-wife in divorce court, custody court, and in hearings and child support a decade ago, and I did it without a lawyer, while she was well represented. She made all kinds of false accusations against me, and that forced her to pay a settlement, which I continue to enjoy today. Although that was a decade ago, it's long gone. So I think that if for no other reason, that gives me a certain level of authority. We're talking about the American woman, but Rollo Tomassi, he writes in a very measured tone. He's consistent. He's schooled in behaviorism, which is a school of thought he generally takes for granted. But it is a school known for its wild oversimplification of human incentives and mechanistic views of the human will. But Tomassi and a tiny handful of others have created a school of thought on intersexual communication and motivation. We conversationally call it the red pill, a reference to the original and, well-known Matrix movie. And it's correct concerning female behavior in postmodern America. It's correct on major issues: the divorce industry, alpha privilege, the nature of beta males, sexual hierarchy, feminist absurdity, female abuse, false domestic abuse claims, hypergamy, the lover-provider difference, frame, sexual market value, or SMV, transactional sex, many other things. I'll talk about these terms here tonight. And it all comes down to, among many other things, but one of the foci is exposing female privilege, the most pervasive and totalitarian form of tyranny in postmodern life. And there's no denying that this is a part of a man's daily experience, but the red pill, for all of its insight, also bases itself on some exceptionally simplistic variables. While I've learned so much, and I shouldn't have been in a position where I had to learn so much from red pill teachings, Tomassi or anyone else. Tomassi today is attacked because he's discovered your typical younger woman's playbook. He's rarely attacked on substantive grounds. He's normally just called names, but you ignore him at your peril. I've criticized several aspects of him, but not so much in his conclusions, mostly in his methods and assumptions. What he's done is extraordinary. One of the problems I have is that they don't really talk about this abstract female nature. A behaviorist doesn't believe in nature to begin with. Of course, it's very strictly nominalist. But females living in a dying postmodern Western world, you don't need a sweeping evolutionary scheme that takes the reader back to prehistory. It claims to be based on evolutionary psychology, but you don't need it to reach the same conclusions concerning the female. The traits that this school of thought has uncovered are very specific to our era, and there's nothing about the essence of the female that is uncovered here. A behaviorist can't talk about essences either. Women are slaves not so much to biology, but to a ruling class that has long since declared war on the family through the sexual revolution. With the Redpill's insight into intersexual communication, it's entirely applicable only to post-sexual revolutionary societies. That is to say, the Western world. Now, we're only talking about a dying postmodern society. There's nothing that we can read back into prehistory. And it does damage to the Red Pill that they insist on doing that. And talking about evolutionary psychology as if that's necessary for their conclusions to be true. So, you remember that game? Every once in a while, you come across it. Screw, marry, kill. Women usually play this quite often. And they list men who they want to screw, who they want to marry, and who they want to kill. It was in The Office. If you've watched that show, I remember it growing up. They used other words for it, but, But it's not just a game. It's a succinct description of how women think. Those three actions concern what they want to do to these different types of men. And the men in their lives are each assigned a fate. You note that marry and screw are different categories of men. That's the distinction. The distinction between the two of those is a linchpin of the entire female mindset. What do I mean? Women divide men, as many of you know, between alphas and betas. Alphas are highly confident. They're very attractive to women for various reasons. It's hard to tell entirely, but maybe they make up 10% of the male population. Betas are seen generally as disposable. These are the men who often languish in the friend zone. Until the women around him, getting older, can't pull the alphas that they used to in the past, or, secondly, that they need to worry about landing a good man and a good father for their financial future with a family. So they trade sexual attraction for emotional stability, reliability, and of course a stable income. Alpha and beta are the men young women would screw and marry, respectively. Now, we're talking about sociobiology. The socio part means that this is not an exact science. You use a word like alpha to describe a small subset of men, a highly successful, when it comes to women, a man pursued by them all the time. Synonyms for alpha include things like player, PUA, lover, playboy, bad boy, Chad, stuff like that. There's often nothing really exceptional about them, except they somehow get lots of girls. And then the more they get, the more other girls are intrigued by their success. Now, contrary to many overexcited analyses online, alpha doesn't necessarily refer to leadership potential, muscularity, or any that doesn't hurt. Alphas can and do exist without these, but they must possess great confidence, charm, and certainly above average looks in some combination. The point is that they have many women at their disposal, and given that fact, they have no incentive to invest much time or resources into any one of them in particular. That forces attractive women to fight among themselves for access to him. Since he has many options, women find the alpha very tough to pin down, and that itself makes him even more desirable. The alpha is the target and subject of female fantasy in general. The beta, on the other hand, is the provider of material goods and or emotional stability. Maybe they're, 25%, maybe 30% of the male population. Synonyms for a beta include simp, provider, Andy Bernard, Plan B, backup boyfriend, the nice guy. When a woman settles, it usually means that she couldn't get an alpha to marry her, so for the sake of stability and her future, she has no choice but to rope a beta for his ability and desire to provide. Women need them, but don't really want them. Betas are far more dependable than alphas because they have a poor history with women and are overjoyed anytime an attractive woman expresses interest, since it's a rare event. But that very excitement is their Achilles heel. Their exhilaration and eagerness to please suggests to women that they have few romantic options, and thus she becomes his overriding preoccupation, itself a signal of his desperation. No woman desires a desperate man. This fact is the main aspect of this most men still don't understand. To a great extent, this is the origin of his secondary status in women's eyes. Betas are not physically unattractive. They have much to offer. But the woman's sexual arousal for him is usually pretty weak, and it's important because sexual attraction is the main difference between a couple that are just friends versus a couple that's romantically involved. Women are attracted to the beta, but they are not aroused by him. Arousal is carnal, while attraction is practical. Betas often don't understand how women think in this regard, but alphas do. Together, alpha and beta comprise at the most 40% of the male population. Today, that might be an overstatement. I don't know. However, there is the bottom, let's say the bottom 60%. This 60% of men are perceived by women as worse than invisible. We call them omegas. For women, they are good for nothing. They are physically repulsive. They're socially inept. Synonyms for the omega are things like neckbeard, creep, discord moderator, basement dweller, Lauren Armstrong, sexual harasser, sub 5. That refers to the well-known 1 to 10 rating system for the opposite sex. The omegas are below 5, while alphas are usually rated 8 or 9 and up, and betas ranking somewhere in between. You talk about a woman being a 9 or an 8 or something. Yeah, they're not exact, but there's always some differences within categories, but rarely between them. No woman looks at an omega and claims he's an 8. So they are useful. The game we talked about, screw, marry, kill. No, these guys are in the kill category. So for our purposes, the omega is irrelevant. Now, the only exception may be their financial contribution to the OnlyFans phenomenon. Such platforms are probably the only place where female companionship and interaction for them are possible, albeit an expensive one. OnlyFans may well be entirely financed by the world's omegas. But the very existence of that platform demonstrates the desperation of the omega male, whom is willing to pay pretty much anything for positive interaction with an attractive woman. And, really, he's not mentioned very much. If you look up a guy named Grant Amato, I don't know what Italian family names their kid Grant, but he is an extreme version of an omega. So what does this all mean? Women need the beta male for utilitarian reasons, but they want the alpha for validational and carnal ones. Now, this applies to broadly attractive women. It doesn't apply to anyone else. Women need to marry the beta, but will always seek the company of the alpha when she can get away with it. So, putting it differently, attractive men are, in a woman's mind, either James Bond or Will Ferrell. And from the day a woman hits puberty, the race is on to secure the alphas of her social world. Women will kill each other in their struggle for the alpha. Given there's very few of them, even sharing them now has become common. It's an ugly race, but no woman who's being honest can deny it exists. On the other hand, no one fights over the beta unless money's involved. Even there, that's a purely utilitarian issue, not an emotional or a carnal one. Women are attracted to money. They are not aroused by it. A man with money is someone to be used and manipulated, not loved or wanted. Money itself is not literally arousing. It can be very attractive. But the impoverished alpha Chad is far preferable to the wealthy beta simp, at least in most circumstances. The best circumstance for a woman in this dying regime is to live off a beta's money while, given how inexperienced betas can be, having an alpha on the side. It's a dangerous game, but millions of women successfully play these odds. Betas have limited options, so they will idealize any receptive woman, sometimes even the non-receptive. They soon come to believe that she is the one, with a capital O, a disease the Redpill calls one-itis. This disastrous beta phenomenon of placing a woman on a pedestal something like that. It's a similar error. A woman is turned off when they're praised to the skies by a man she just met. It's not just that she could never live up to this idealized status, but more importantly, she knows that her being put on this pedestal is based mostly on the man having few options. In his ignorance, the beta male thinks that this kind of praise is the way to a woman's heart. This obsequious flattery, overstated romantic gestures, this sycophantic sympathy, that somehow that will endear her to him. But no, it's not true. It's a common error of monumental proportions. Overly generalized and constant compliments, made while, like, say, on a second date, are part of the reason why they're usually rejected, especially by younger women not quite yet ready to start a family, in favor of the alpha who, given his status, doesn't really compliment her at all. The typical woman, even just slightly above average in looks, they're complimented many times a day. So compliments aren't really interesting to her. It's the lack of fawning compliments that show the woman that a man is a little different. I personally have used this in the past. I don't like the over-the-top romantic gestures that many men do early on in a relationship. There's a big difference between chasing a woman and showing interest in one. Between chasing a woman and pursuing a woman. Yes, he likes her, but he does not fawn over her. You've all heard women say that men are afraid of commitment, or that men always cheat, or that they can't find a good man. Keep in mind that she's not actually referring to men in general. Most men are invisible to her. No, when she uses the word man, she means alpha males alone. For her, male is the same as alpha male. Betas aren't really a challenge to pin down. Alphas always cheat, quote unquote, because they have many attractive women at their beck and call. And this also makes them very difficult to get to commit, for the very same reason. Every beauty wants to nail down the campus alpha and make her friends green with envy. That's also why such men get the best from women while betas languish later on with unenthusiastic leftovers. Women settling for betas are still dreaming about the alpha she had on spring break in college. It's her version of putting a man on a pedestal that her beta husband today could never match. That is what we call an alpha widow. A woman instinctively knows that she has the power in any relationship with a beta male, and that she holds his emotional well-being in the palm of her hand, and that power is anything but a turn-on. Betas live for commitment and family. They're not bad men, they're not losers. But they are termed nice guys, a phrase that's anything but a compliment. Sometimes a woman marrying a beta is often unaware of her true feelings. She often shields herself from the fact that he's a downgrade. But she still needs him for a stable family, for long-term faithfulness. Real love is certainly possible between the two, but genuine, intense physical desire, that's a separate matter altogether. It's generally thought that in this dying society, and it only applies to this dying society, when a secular woman agrees to marry a man, the woman is saying to the world that she's so in love that she's abandoning all other options for him. She must think that he's so wonderful that no other man can compare, and therefore she will never even dream about having sex with anyone else. Must be an incredible man, right? Far above the common herd. But is this true? Now, an attractive woman during her childbearing years, she's saying that the man she really wants isn't capable of marriage because he's simply too attractive, he's too popular. He can't be trusted. He's constantly tempted. So the bride is actually saying that the guy she's marrying is the best practical bet she can attract and keep. When the babies arrive, she starts getting older, less attractive, she starts getting fatter, she starts getting, she's pregnant, etc., etc. Now, no intelligent woman is going to want to build a family with a guy because he's great in bed or has the highest cheekbones. No, she marries a man because he is dependable. She's marrying him because he is not exceptionally handsome or sexually proficient. Having those two sorts of traits in combination is extremely rare. Marriage and sex under natural law, of course, are tightly bound together, but we live in a society that rejects natural law. It's a society that's run by sexual revolutionaries and women. And so now those two things have little relationship to each other. Alpha males get arousal, beta males get attraction. The alpha male gets laid, the beta gets married. The bride may even be planning on having the man she really wants to be the father of her kids, while the hapless beta will be used to raise them. So fathers are to dads what boyfriends are to husbands in this case. It's a marriage that, given the fact that the society is run by revolutionaries, it contains the seeds of its own destruction, because the woman will give the alpha her best in all respects, doing everything she can to please him, but of course she'll take the beta for granted. The only difference between a female friend, as I said before, a female friend and a girlfriend, is sexual attraction. Now, these realities are rooted in what the Redpill calls frame. This is a common Redpill term. It's vaguely defined because it resists clear conceptualization. Like in any sort of relationship, one partner is more dominant than the other. One's more experienced, one is more assertive. Those are the foundations of what we call frame. It refers to the partner's relative positions of strength. And frame comes from status. An alpha will create a very different frame than others due to the fact that even when he's married, he still has many options. He can recover from a breakup very quickly, as can most attractive women. Without options, however, one partner, that's usually the male, will hang on to the relationship for dear life, petrified of going back to the painful meat grinder of the dating world. But once that mentality is detected, the women will flee. And the poor man who is labeled like that will suddenly go from pleasantly tolerable to creepy. And often accusations of harassment are not too far behind. So quite literally, frame refers to how issues in a relationship are understood. Alphas are the dominant partner, so in general things will be on his terms. For the beta, their life together is often on her terms. Many of you have heard the word game used as a technical term by this very same school, and that's a conclusion from all of this. The insights that I have just laid out have to be applied to someone's dating life. Keep in mind the concept of dating and chasing women. This is all fairly new, historically speaking. But most of us know that men can't appear too eager. You have to at least make it appear that you have many romantic options waiting for you. Shouldn't be too quick to do favors for women, or to appear to care very much in general, giving the impression that they have something very extraordinary to offer. But of course, a man can't take this too far. There has to be an underlying attraction and confidence, or I should say connection, for this to even begin to work. Looks and confidence come first, the rest follow from it. The typical beta uses these strategies at his peril. Unfortunately, since he's a dime a dozen, and she may well take these actions as a sign of disinterest, since she has usually far more options than he does. For a man who's unattractive, to pretend to act like an alpha makes him look ridiculous. But for most of history, game wasn't necessary. It's only needed in what we call an unregulated dating market, a historically rare state of affairs. Only the postmodern Western world has anything like it. It's unregulated in the sense that there are no arranged marriages and there's few constraints on the female sex drive. Well, there's certainly many placed on the overwhelming majority of men. Since the male sex drive is far stronger than the female, women possess the objects of this potent desire. The sexual free market is inherently matriarchal. And that status is connected, of course, with the discovery of or use of birth control and feminism. And the two things are very closely connected. Betas find themselves victims of a sudden divorce. All of a sudden, suddenly he sees the labor of decades, as well as his children and maybe his reputation, going into the hands of the woman who always saw him as second rate. They'll also go to her new boyfriend, too. This is a huge source of income for women, and it lay at the heart of their huge home ownership rates, startup businesses. This is how women become self-made women. Of course, we put that in quotes. Most of it comes through theft. Betas are easily discarded, and both the state and public opinion will support her, no matter how absurd her claims might be against him. There's another term. That term is hypergamy. It's a huge part of the red pill vocabulary. Like most concepts here, it often rests in the female subconscious. It refers to an attractive woman's drive to improve her present social status through finding a partner who might be more alpha than the one she presently has. Now, what improve her status might mean depends on the context. Could be access to money, social status, popularity, social respect, appearance, family ties, whatever. But for any visceral reaction to exist from a woman, there has to be an alpha presence. That makes the frame the man's, unless, of course, someone even more alpha comes around. Keep in mind that these only exist in respect to men. There are no female alphas, since female power exists only in their presence, not their status or their accomplishments or anything else. A beautiful woman only has to breathe. That's all she needs. The situation now, and the social sciences have shown this over and over again, that your top 40% of women in the looks department, that's a lot of women, are all going after the same top 10% of men. That's what dating is in 2025. The only thing that exists for men in hypergamy is maybe in looks or in youth. And that applies only to that tiny percentage of men who have a chance with these more attractive and younger women. But for betas, of course, they're just happy to have married a quality woman in their mind, or at least that's what he thinks. The only time women have to worry about something like game or gaming someone is when they're faced with alphas. No woman has to game a beta. They can be, she could have one very easily. So the red pill suggests that young, attractive women are programmed according to them by this vague evolutionary process to sniff out false alphas and real betas, and under most circumstances, filtering the betas out of the dating pool. Their existential fear is to have married the wrong guy, a beta that convinces her that he's an alpha. And one of the ways that women do this is by asking what's called fitness test questions. I first learned this from Rollo Tomasi. It's a hardwired mechanism, and they will test men asking questions of him autonomously and subconsciously. It's not really a free action. Even if they're aware of doing it, they'll still do it. Men want to verify sexual availability, as Tomasi says, to the same degree women want to verify a masculine dominance and confidence level. So how does game fit in? Asking fitness questions is a function of a degenerating postmodern society. It has no foundation in life prior to this. There was no dating in earlier civilizations. Evolutionary developments in social or psychological life occurred before there could be any record of them is convenient, but it's unnecessary. Social conventions didn't exist back then, so relations between the sexes in the ancient world can't be based on anything that we would comprehend. Social and psychological evolution is nonsense. I mean, you don't have to believe in Darwin to know that women must make sure that the man she's marrying is truly the man he purports to be. If he's not, and she commits to him, she'll resent the one who pulled the wool over her eyes. Her whole family may be compromised. This is, fitness questions are ways to expose the man's true self, to see how alpha he truly is. And this happens in the first few dates. Postmodern society only knows power. This power is manifest in subtle ways. It's the only reality that really can be discerned. So these fitness test questions, it's a manifestation of frame. Having the right answers ready become a key point in having game when you are on the dating market. And the word market, I think, is correct. Women can be, and sometimes are even mostly, creatures of the subconscious. Often don't know or don't want to know why they behave the way that they do. This is part of how they can bracket their behavior when they emotionally destroy a lesser man. Much of her actions are not subject to reason. They don't originate in the rational part of her nature and are not susceptible to rational analysis or justification. That's why they have a monstrous advantage over the man. But you don't have to accept the existence of the primordial soup to see why. This doesn't come from the evolutionary subconscious. It can very simply come from the desire to establish plausible deniability, or even to soothe her conscience. The red pill's biggest problem when it talks about intersexual communication today, they're trying to ground their theory in a vague, non-scientific concept of social evolution, rather than, as it should be, rooted in the degenerate individualist society that has perverted all relationships. The postmodern Western world is unnatural. Its social customs are equally so. Hence, female behavior doesn't come from evolution, it comes from devolution. There's some tremendous insight into the red pill. You ignore them at your peril. As I say, there's many questions that arise about the simplistic definitions and traits and types as far as it goes, but it's still quite useful. The red pill says that their answer to female nature, quote unquote, is to spin plates. Spinning plates is an artless metaphor for having many women as options, but not committing to anyone. This acts as an insurance policy where if a man is dumped, he has a few others around to pick up the slack. Since he's not committed to any of them, there would be no emotional fallout if they were to break up. It's really an awful way to think. But there's a few nagging questions. If you've come across some of this stuff, and you need to if you haven't, let me ask just a few questions that came to mind when I first came across this many years ago. Is it female nature that they're talking about? Or women in a dying, amoral society that puts a premium on appearance, money, and sex? Can anyone make reference to a female nature while solely using postmodern women as data? The rotation of women, this plate spinning nonsense, it seems to preclude love. And why is love never a variable in this school of thought? It is not. For a man to have sex with as many women as possible, it seems to be filling a psychological void. And why is that the main goal anyway? What kind of relationships are these? What would the world look like if everyone followed consistently this kind of strategy? Could a society at all exist under these conditions? At what age does this become irrelevant? Which, by the way, is a question that doesn't get asked very much either. Who has the time or the energy for this kind of plate spinning? Or the money or anything else? And how can a relationship have anything less than 100% commitment? Spinning seems to imply that a man is not giving 100% any one girl in particular. So how solid could these relationships be? If you gave 20% of one's effort into any specific relationship, that would ensure its failure. So then plate spinning becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is it possible that there are more variables other than alpha and beta? Attractiveness and providing. Do all women define alpha the same way? What does confidence mean? And how does one avoid one-itis? Is one-itis the same thing as being in love? How can you get married without thinking that a woman that you're with is the one? What kind of relationship could ever exist if the man is aware that almost everything a woman does is based on finding someone better? Is this a relationship at all? Aren't there always better men? What sort of paranoia would this create? How is plate spinning a route to happiness? Are such men happy at all? Is it productive at all to assume that everything a woman says in this regard is a lie? Trust could never exist in such a relationship if the red pill is true. What about self-esteem? How come that doesn't seem to affect hypergamy? A man with low self-esteem gets rejected quite often. But where does self-esteem come from? Could low self-esteem be taken by the woman as a symptom of his past rather than an inherent aspect of his personality? Is a man insecure and hence repulsive? Or does it come from previous abuse? Can a woman even make this distinction? Even women, do they like the emotional turmoil that hypergamy brings them? What's the goal when there's always a better man out there? How can it lead to anything other than permanent instability? How can this make anyone happy, especially when it doesn't end? For women, what is the point of even landing an alpha male when he could just find someone new tomorrow? Having an alpha fall in love with you makes him what? Is he still attractive anymore? It seems that this entire conception and the postmodern romantic world is just dedicated to avoiding love. Now, none of this is to take away from the essential truths that the Red Pill puts out there. Again, the evolutionary psychology nonsense, it does damage to the theory. Importing postmodern sensibilities into much older societies is a huge weakness. These people are not historians. A theory rises and falls in its assumptions. Yes, the Red Pill's contribution is in analyzing the behavior of the typical secular woman born and raised in the aftermath of the sexual revolution. That's where it has its power. But it has no applicability before then, and it need not reference anything that existed prior to our own very, very sick era. The concept of evolutionary psychology is not much of a model. As I mentioned before, the primary framework doesn't rest on any real empirical foundation. It can't really make any empirical claims. Its frame of reference exists in a hypothetical past that conveniently possesses no historical records of any kind. Evolutionary theory, if it says anything, argues that organisms are driven by a survival instinct, like a life force, something that must exist at the first appearance of any organic life whatsoever. It can't be added later on. Adaptations don't mean anything unless they promote the ability of the organism to not just survive, but to thrive, which really isn't saying a whole lot. Doesn't it make sense that the beta male would be the dominant group here, not the alpha? I mean, betas are the ones that are getting married, albeit maybe for the wrong reasons. Alphas would be the last group of men to be rewarded in the hypothetical prehistoric world that evolutionary psychology assumes exists, that the Red Pill always references. Alpha is not synonymous with wealthy or powerful. Let me quote Tomasi here. And he's speaking to young men when he says this. If you are chronically depleted of testosterone and or subjected to the calming effects of oxytocin, your sexual viability is at a disadvantage. In fact, from an evolutionary standpoint, the beta males of our feral hunter-gatherer beginnings would be more prone to masturbation as a sexual release since, theoretically, they would have had less access to breeding opportunities than alpha males. It would then follow that definitive subconscious behavioral and chemical cues would evolve to aid females in selecting the best mate for paternal investment. Now, much as I love Tomasi, claiming to know what prehistoric beta males did in their spare time just stretches credulity. There was no designation prior to civilization, since no one knows anything about these hypothetical prehistoric worlds. The Red Pill's great error is unwittingly imposing postmodern romantic alienation and revolutionary corruption very specific to the U.S. after, say, 1970, onto ages long past, long before our own, to which very few can relate. The truth is that the American world, post-1970, is historically unique, and not in a good way, and quite conventional. The last thing you could ever call it is natural. The Red Pill uses a stylized development cycle for women. It only really applies to attractive women who go to college, generally speaking. It's also very new, because there was no room for any of this to exist prior to, say, the 1970s. The theory says that from ages, say, 17 to 26 or so, the attractive girl is a party girl, having sex with as many men as possible that she deems to be physically attractive. Her criteria revolve around physical appearance, maybe an immature conception of social status. Since men value sex more than women, women have inherited the gatekeeper role. Sex is very readily available to most females, but something so plentiful can only have minimal value. That changes when you're talking about an alpha. That becomes very valuable. His status changes the equation. Suddenly, this prude girl turns into a porn star with Johnny Quarterback or Chad Thundercock, while Andy Bernard receives a much more tepid attitude. This leaves Andy Bernard stewing in anger, resentment, envy. The beta male, unaware of his status, self-loathing even. The betas of the world are jealous of female power, her apparent happiness, and the effortless and costless sex alphas receive. Then we're told that she hits the wall, which is a theoretical construct. It's quite real. whereby a woman becomes aware that she's not attractive as she used to be. It's hard to tell where this starts, maybe late 20s. The claim is that here she begins to see all the men that she wants going for younger women, and she gets upset at this, since alpha traits up until now have been her only priority. As a painful result, the former beauty begins to make plans to settle for Will Ferrell, the proverbial beta provider, one of the least fortunate men in the history of social theory. Tomasi says this: between the ages of 28 to 30, sometimes later for attractive women perpetuating their party years, women often enter into more cognitive awareness of their personal conditions with regard to their declining sexual market value. This phase I call the epiphany phase. It's the point where the subconscious awareness a woman has of her sexual market value in relation to her eventual date with the wall can no longer be subconsciously repressed and ignored. Well, in our sick society, that is certainly true. It certainly exists, and the epiphany phase is something that men have to be very careful about identifying. This is a subset of attractive women who have realized that she might be good with Andy Bernard because Vinnie Barbarino is no longer available. She wasn't really aware of this before. She snags then the man that she rejected back in college, a man who's now ecstatic at this newfound attention. So he gets pity sex in exchange for all manner of financial and emotional support, and the poor sap has no idea what's happening due to his inexperience and the fact that he's raised in a gynocentric social order. She too might be aware that he's clueless and he might not fully understand why she resents him for it all. It's possible she may be trying to shield herself, trying to shield her conscience, rather than her feeling springing from some primeval impulse. The party phase of a young woman assumes that the young woman has most things provided for her, leaving her free to pursue men for physical characteristics only. It's a class-based theory to some extent because most women are painfully aware of the need for an income and support at all ages, not just like 27 and up. But there's a lot of questions about this too. Women at the party phase care about sex and all the ego-stroking, everything that sex implies, and getting men the other women want. Women's looks don't necessarily fade around 30, but somehow they become aware of this around that age with hard-nosed realism. Or that good-looking dominant men care for younger women, like few dominant men like older women, older meaning like 19 to 32. Is that true? That older women have no interest for them, no matter how attractive? Is she capable of falling in love until the wall comes around? Does she only understand things like a provider male when her looks fade? Do alphas ever fall in love? Could beta males, that is to say, dependable providers, they can't be physically attractive or proficient in any way? That conventional hotness is the primary drive for women in her younger years? Is it true that few young, attractive women care about stability, family, or love? Has anyone noticed that this kind of meaninglessness rarely makes anyone happy, regardless of its origin? And the fact that happiness is rarely talked about at all when we deal with these subjects. Many other assumptions are to be found here. Just a few that it came to mind. It doesn't mean that women get to marry their first choice, but even if they do, unfortunately they learn the hard way that those types of men can't be pinned down for long. Women marry the men they think they need, not the ones they want, even if it's purely subconscious. But you don't need an analysis of prehistoric man for that to be understood. Now, what I'm trying to say with all of this is that the Red Pill takes evolutionary psychology at its foundation for all of this. And what that school is dealing with, without not fully understanding it, is the state of nature that comes from Thomas Hobbes. It's this revolutionary drive to start over again, leading social theorists, starting with Hobbes, to imagine a world where men existed without law, customs, religion, language, or anything else, starting from zero, trying to envision man as man without any of the accretions of civilized life. How would men behave if they weren't influenced by civilization or conventional morals? If that were known, then history would know man qua man. Man as he is rather than as society has made him. Observing the behavior of men today only tells us how they respond to conventional social morality, long-established norms, whether good or bad. No one really believes that wild animals can be studied solely from those that are in a zoo. No, you have to observe them in the wild. The revolutionary Enlightenment wanted to study man in the wild, but of course, that was just in their imagination. The state of nature is a myth, of course. But it's still the very foundation of modern politics and even modern science. Man has always existed in structured societies, whether they like it or not. All sociobiological theory has to assume the existence of the state of nature. They can't talk about hunter-gatherer societies because they've already organized. They're already organized, and they're already influenced by the conventional. So you can't determine anything about man's quote-unquote natural state from any of this. Sociobiology has to assume a uniformly lawless and culturalist vacuum from whence instincts for raw self-preservation can develop without reference to any conventional rules. To the extent conventional morality takes over later on, such instincts will become less valuable and even harmful. What serves man in the state of nature may not serve him in civilization. Routledge, the book publisher, put out the Companion to the State of Nature. In its introduction, it says this: in imagining what it would be like to be without a state, we also imagine what it would take for us to create one. Philosophers have used the idea of a state of nature to argue that the state is based on an agreement between people, that really they mean among people, to live together under laws, so that the state of nature helps answer another question. It tells us a story about how a group of individuals who were free to become obligated to obey the laws of a state. The story is not meant to be factual. Perhaps human beings have never lived without group rules and submission to anyone who has the power to enforce them. Nevertheless, we could come to understand what justifies this situation. Why is it a good thing, if it is, and why we should accept it, if we should, by imagining what it would be to live without the state. Now, these people, this is a terrible introduction. This is supposed to be the scholarly introduction here, and it's not just the state. It's everything that goes into it. Morals, language, culture, religion, everything else. It's not just law. Because the problem is that man has always existed as a part of civilization. Therefore, the state of nature is absurd. Revolutionary writers in the 17th century use this totally unverifiable and hypothetical construct to project their own desires onto history and to use these as actual functioning objects of observation. Rousseau saw them as peaceful loners. Hobbes saw them as violent and power-seeking. John Locke saw them as gentlemen worried about the chaos that would ensue if men judged disputes in their own case, which is a primary concern in his version. This is important because the Red Pill talks about all the traits that we've discussed as existing from evolution, that this is how women have always been. This is how men have always been. The sexual revolution destroyed all of the barriers to this coming to the surface, and therefore that's what makes it useful, and it's simply not true. Let me give you an example here. When a sociobiologist, someone who believes in this psychological, evolutionary psychology, they make reference to a certain emotion, let's say something like envy. For example, they speculate. Where did envy come from? How could you possibly know this? So they have to come up with something that it served a certain purpose in this prehistoric era. They kind of settle on what sounds right given today's priorities. So they may say something like, society progresses because the emotion of envy drove men to perform tasks to keep up with their neighbors and rivals. That would be envy's origin, and hence its purpose. It came into existence and was useful because envy is what forced men to work to keep up with their neighbors, to avoid the pain of envy and jealousy. And so they continued to work to create things and to do things, and society as a result progressed. They might even conclude then that envy was, back then, a necessary emotion for any social progress to take place. It drove men to act in productive ways lest his rivals dominate him. Now, that emotional engine might be out of place in today's civilization. It may be destructive, or at least a mixed blessing. And the theory sounds, I guess, superficially plausible, But that's as good as they get. Because envy, if that's the claim, and it is their claim, by the way, doesn't that imply a fairly complex society with established rights and duties and rules of ownership? Not to mention a mutually accepted scale by which men could be assessed relative to others. So using that as the origin and purpose of envy would be absurd. They seem to think that because something sounds right, it must be true. Now, there's a group called the Center for Evolutionary Psychology. In a book, one of their central texts is the Handbook of Emotions, edited by Michael Lewis, came out in 2000. They talk about envy, too. Envy that arises from adultery. And they're trying to make sense out of why adultery is seen as a bad thing. And why people find this so awful. And they talk about the elements that have to be in place for this. A sexual rival with a capacity for social action and violence, as well as allies of this rival. A discrete probability that one's mate has conceived with a sexual rival. Changes in the net lifetime reproductive returns of investing further in the mating relationship. A probable decrease in the degree to which the unfaithful mate's mechanisms value the victim of infidelity. A cue that the victim of infidelity will likely have been deceived about a range of past events, leading the victim to confront the likelihood that his memory is permeated with false information, that the victim's status and reputation for being effective at defending his own interests would collapse, inviting challenges in other areas. And they list all of these, and they say that this is just a few of the many factors that constitute a list of elements associated in probabilistic clusters, and that constitutes an evolutionary recurrent structure of a situation of sexual infidelity. The emotion of sexual jealousy evolved in response to these properties of the world, and should be evidence of this in its computational design. In other words, this is what leads people to take adultery and infidelity. Again, this is a world before history now. This is the origin of the anger and the resentment that comes from infidelity. Now, the sheer number of anachronistic assumptions would take volumes to adequately discuss. Margaret Mead tried to do this same thing with the tribesmen of Samoa to discover the so-called natural man, the man before time, despite the fact that it's been refuted many times. She just imposed her own agenda onto a people who never reflected the attitudes they thought they should. She thought they should. But they're trying to figure out the origin of something like jealousy and envy that coming from this kind of sexual competition. But there's so many problems with this. Were men that self-aware to be jealous at this era? Where did the concept of sexual property come from in an age before property? Why make reference to hunter-gatherers, given their fairly strict conventions? And why are hunter-gatherers assumed to have existed prior to civilization? What existed prior to the evolution of this emotion? Would that era of human development be more normative? Where does the social come from in the first place? Would this hypothetical group of people define truth in the same way that postmodern Americans would? Why should we believe that these primitives thought in terms of costs and benefits, an abstract idea that comes from modern economics? Where did these primitive people get this level of intellectual introspection? Did that evolve? And what did it evolve from? Wouldn't those in these imagined hunter-gatherer societies be fairly small groups? If so, could you hide anything? How could you get away with anything in these small groups, assuming, of course, that getting away with something was a concern at all? Now, why do I mention all of this? The traits that men and women have when it comes to romance and family, it doesn't derive from evolution. It derives from our own adaptation to the decay of Christianity, the family, patriarchal authority. These are the causes of modern corruption. This is where the alpha-beta distinction comes from. This is where hypergamy comes from. Rollo Tomassi, again, who, is brilliant in so many things, he says, in a pre-sexual revolution social order, a woman's capacity to optimize her hypergamy and pacify her uncertainty had a variety of extrinsic limitations: guilt, cultural stigma, shame, moral and religious conviction, obligations to family, arranged marriages, polygamy, and yes, even rape, were all a means to limiting a woman's decision-making capacity to optimize her innate hypergamy. Well, when you talk about pre-sexual revolution, you have to be talking about every single society that ever existed except the postmodern West. There was no such concept of an unregulated romantic market before 1970. So when did these innate traits ever come to be? The assumption is that women have always possessed these traits, but because of all of these conventional morals in different civilizations in the past, they really couldn't come to the surface. They were hidden from public view. So I guess these traits have to be assumed as an article of faith. The other assumption is that important life choices, sexual desire, instinctive drives, that these are juggernauts that conventions such as religious conviction or family obligations could never withstand, or that such institutions ensured the woman would be more careful and circumspect in her behavior. Let me quote him again. Biologically, it's postulated that our larger brains allowed us to develop a capacity for reason, but that doesn't mean other animals lack the same faculty or facility. It's just that the rational process is less developed, some would say less environmentally necessary, in those animals by orders of degree. Dogs, for example, rely primarily on their instinctual processes and the mental, vestigial firmware they're born with to solve most of their existential environmental problems. This doesn't mean they lack the ability to learn and form novel, adaptive behaviors using rudimentary forms of logic. Animals can be taught things, but their capacity to form novel ideas and behaviors is limited to their cognitive abilities. Humans, being the apex species on the planet, had the leisure to make the time necessary to evolve a capacity for logic, and as such the rational process developed in us. The problem here is the belief that there was a time where men didn't have these faculties or instincts. If there were ever such a time, humanity couldn't have survived. I mean, it's one of the big problems in evolutionary ideas in general. Like, for example, when you talk about the evolution of wings on a bat, the problem is that half-formed wings of the intermediary species were of no use, if anything, a hindrance. You can't really call them wings at all. If they didn't help the animal fly, they weren't wings. And the same goes for cognition itself. How did man function in the intermediary stages? What's it like to be half-rational? Or aren't most people half-rational now? Or is that just an example of equivocation? The evolutionist isn't using reason in the same way the ancients did. And where did the concept of leisure come from? I mean, man is poorly adapted physically for life on this planet except through reason. So reason is necessary even for the most rudimentary survival skills. Leisure implies the existence of civilization. It's inconceivable without it. Reason requires community, advanced language, and a sophisticated economy. So it can't be the result of these. Civilization, reason, and instinct have to exist at the same time, or you reach absurdity. Now, there's something called strategic pluralism theory that was, it has been around a long time, but it came from one very important study was from Marty Hazelton. And it connects all of this with the sexual stuff that the Redpill deals with. According to strategic pluralism theory, men have evolved to pursue reproductive strategies that are contingent on the value of the mating market, More attractive men accrue reproductive benefits from spending more time seeking multiple mating partners and relatively less time investing in offspring. In contrast, the reproductive effort of less attractive men, who do not have the same mating opportunities, is better allocated to investing heavily in their mates and offspring and spending relatively less time in seeking additional mates. From a woman's perspective, the ideal is to attract a partner who confers both long-term investment benefits and genetic benefits. Not all women, however, will be able to attract long-term investing mates who also display heritable fitness cues. Consequently, women face trade-offs in choosing mates because they may be forced to choose between males displaying fitness indicators or those who will assist in offspring care and be good long-term mates. Now, what's happening here? The very conception of Machiavellian strategy in these matters is, again, of very recent provenance. It's a result of corruption, not reason. Only in the modern era did you have any conception of sexual attractiveness as an independent variable. In ancient societies, young men couldn't have multiple partners because women were sequestered in and by their families and didn't mix with single young males. All men who weren't monastics had to have a family to function, and his wife was almost always his first and only sexual experience. These kind of things weren't fetishized back then, as they are today. and were rarely even the topic of conversation. A woman getting married who wasn't a virgin was often seen as a victim of a crime. Rape is something that shows up in Greek myths all the time. And if there's any society that's very strict in dealing with that, it's hunter-gatherer societies. There were no fitness cues. There was no dating. There was no concept of sexy. Physical attractiveness had nothing to do with mating opportunities. And mentions of it have to be placed in their proper context, because the Western mind today sexualizes everything. No, homosexuality was not accepted in ancient Greece, and there are many laws survived outlawing it. Only the Western reader imports such perversions into these texts. Families and marriages were arranged in one sense or another, directly or indirectly. Romantic love is the creation of Hollywood, not evolution, and certainly not the troubadour poets or chivalry. The Red Pill says that the cardinal rule of sexual strategies: for one gender's sexual strategy to succeed, the other gender must compromise or abandon its own. Well, that's kind of a truism at one level. There can't be two totally dominant persons in a relationship. Dominance is not fungible over space or time. But the assumption here is that men want to have as much sex as possible without being tied down, which is hardly the case in 2025, let alone in 1025. Not to mention only postmodern alphas have this luxury anyway. Well, the assumption might be fun in theory. It's certainly not in practice. The worship, almost, of sex is very recent. Sometimes they mention things like the harem, used as an example to show that men aren't naturally monogamous. A harem is a form of seclusion for women. It mostly comprised the husband's relatives. Only for the upper crust of the elite, of course. It wasn't a pleasure palace. The Western Orientalist conceptions of the harem are absurd caricatures. Men weren't always sex-obsessed, and not any collection of women were automatically a sexual orgy. The Arabic harem, the Thai puridar, the Russian terem, it existed for female protection, education. It was a sacred space that very few men were permitted to enter, including the husband. The Arabic word itself, harem, means a sacred and untouched place. In the Far East, the zenana, rather than being an adult film set popularized by the European imagination, it functioned as a social domain of female household members. The modern conceptions of the harem are more the product of fictional works like the 1001 Nights, which came out in 1721, The Lustful Turk, which came out in 1828. That's the product of the debased British aristocracy. This is where the notion of the harem as a sexual Xanadu came from. There were more projections of sexual fantasy than actual history. Most historians, myself included, make the argument that the harem only really came into existence in the Islamic world during the Abbasid Caliphate that ended in 1258. And they're really only in its decline, but such arrangements were very rare. The Persian monarch Khosrow II was said to be a hedonist with respect to his harem, and his behavior was loudly condemned at the time, eventually leading to his overthrow. The Mughal harem, like the imperial harem of the Turks, was a civilization to itself. It contained markets, it had bazaars, workshops, kitchens, playgrounds, schools, and baths. It wasn't sexualized. The harem was born out of necessity, not of sexual pleasure. Only the most powerful man could have one anyway, and they came into existence because bringing a woman into his household was most often a hostage after a treaty was signed. Or more basically, all the women in the huge households of noble men. Women in the harem were themselves elite women. Primitive men couldn't have anything like this. This was a product of high cultures only, and certainly were anything but evidence against monogamy. The mere fact that a man's sex drive is strong doesn't mean monogamy is an aberration. It does not follow. It's an apples and oranges comparison anyway. It only means that male sex drive needs to be controlled, and the control of a woman's appearance is a part of this. It's almost impossible for the contemporary Western man to conceive of a world where sexual relations weren't the sine qua non of manhood. But most of human history saw sexuality as merely necessary, rather than the very highest good of all things. Male thirst doesn't come from our natural constitution. It comes from the constant provoking of the male sex drive by endless depiction of beautiful women in media, women's fashion, pornography, and the constant pop cultural mantra that today's hypersexuality is normal, while every other arrangement in the past was repressive. Only in recent decades has one notch count ever meant anything except a measure of man's criminality. A high body count was hardly a virtue before the sexual revolution. It was a vice. And it was a vice that removed men from the possibility of a family and therefore from membership in society. In Russian, the concept of a stud was a term of abuse, to the extent it was used at all. Words like прелюбодей, the adulterer, arch-prosedret, babnik, a womanizer, these are all terms of abuse, taken from a less common word for wolf. It's an insult. It refers to a dangerous man. Words like Sayed, heartbreaker, or Volochisia, occasionally used. Most of these are borrowed from the West anyway. Volochisia comes from verbs denoting being dragged or pulled, being controlled by one's sexual passions, implying that man is weak. None of these words that might be used for stud or whatever, none of these are compliments. And most, by the way, are very recent additions to the Russian language. Such a man was always seen as unstable, manipulative, and incapable of heading a family. And it was no different anywhere else. The point I'm trying to make is the way that the Red Pill understands contemporary dating is absolutely true. Everything that they lay out, what we've talked about in the very beginning of this, is a fact, unfortunately. But this has nothing to do with human nature. It has nothing to do with a woman's nature. It has to do with a dying society in the West. This stuff was imposed on the Western world. Everything we think in terms of sexuality today is an utter perversion to how it had been thought of from the dawn of time. Evolutionary psychology is based around the mythology of the state of nature. There's no evidence that any such a thing ever existed. You can impose whatever you want onto it. The Red Pill, yes, absolutely correct. I mean, I firmly support most of what they do, just within these confines. The gynocentric world we live in is real, using things like toxic masculinity and other slogans to destroy men. Red Pill has deconstructed the divorce industry, the white knight, the devastation, especially of the collegiate male, the legislation of hypergamy, the pedestal, female entitlement and privilege, make-believe rape culture, the irrationality of modern marriage, the epiphany phase, the one male vulnerability as a liability, the women's desire for strength, female arrogance, and all the rest. That's all true. These are critical ideas. These are powerful contributions to bringing down the present matriarchal tyranny that we're all false to. We're all on the same side here. My objections have more to do with their methods and their assumptions than their conclusions. But these are substantial holes in the Red Pill theory. It doesn't mean they're incorrect. They just base themselves on incorrect foundations. They're correct in what they're pointing out, but then when they went back and tried to ground it somewhere, that's when they went wrong. Logic can't work when terms aren't well defined, and certainly not when most of the theory rests on the unverifiable. Yes, the behavior of young middle-class women, that's easily observable. And they bear out these observations to a dismal degree. But while being evidence of the Red Pill, it's not evidence for it being based on evolutionary psychology. I reject Malthus, Darwin, Spencer. You can reject them and come to the exact same conclusions the Red Pill does, with no contradiction. There is no female nature in this sense of the term. No, these relationships have not always existed. Earlier centuries were not sexualized. Romance did not exist. Sex was not raised to the sine qua non of success like it is today. It was a radically secondary and practical concern. It was messy. It was totally unconnected with romance. Dating didn't exist. The sexual revolution was just that. It was a break with the past, not its liberation. So much of the Red Pill today is based on very simplistic and non-systematic terminology. The phenomenon that we're talking about, that's destroyed families, that's destroyed people, is what? 50 years old. We talked about the state of nature because that's what has to be assumed if you want to believe that the present existence, and when we talk about the male sex drive and female manipulation and all that, those drives didn't exist 200, 500 years ago. And what I mean is, of course, the sex drive always existed, but not nearly what we're talking about today. When something is so manipulated and constantly promoted, of course it's going to be very strong. But there's no reason to believe that it's always been that way. So many people want to tell you that male monogamy is not natural. Well, it certainly is natural because the family is natural. People only think in those terms today because the sex drives have been provoked to such an extent that it becomes dangerous. Then the regime turns around and throws men in prison for following this incredibly dangerous drive. Deliberately provoking the male sex drive is one of the stupidest things that any human being can do. What do you think? What good is going to come out of this? Nothing good comes out of this. It destroys everything. Men are manipulated beyond belief. Women are completely enslaved to all of this. What people desire, what people want, is so artificially invented by the regime. It has nothing to do with nature whatsoever. And God knows it has nothing to do with evolution. If you want to believe that the hunter-gatherer, whatever of that exists today, if you want to use them as examples, they are the harshest. They kill adulterers. They're not sexual revolutionaries. They are the strictest. The farther back you go, the stricter you get. That's something that Margaret Mead drove her crazy. The situation in romance and dating and sexuality in the dying postmodern Western world, that's entirely unique to us. It's unique, maybe you could find it in other dying societies, maybe the dying Roman society, I don't know. But there was certainly no media. There was certainly nothing. I mean, the Jews had pornography and prostitution in all their bars and taverns wherever they went. But that has to be artificially provoked. It's not something normal or natural. Nevertheless, the Redpill writers, really, I only trust Rollo Tomassi. Very few others are. They usually come from him. He gets plagiarized as much as I do. There's no connection with evolutionary psychology. The connection is devolution, not evolution. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.